I ain't gonna tell you my first and last name. Most people know me as Did David.
You bought heroin off a transvestite?
No introduction. Jenny from the cul-de-sac.
Nick makes a chilling threat against an animal.
I'm gonna go kill that.
And seemingly predicted his own fate behind bars, where he currently sits without bail.
And you know what? You're gonna have to bail me out of jail.
In the previous video, we looked at reporting from TMZ suggesting that because Nick had been diagnosed, is that right? Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he would be able to skip prison and plead not guilty by reason of insanity.
This is feeling like a real case of where he will plead, at least, not guilty by reason of insanity. That doesn't mean that the jury's going to automatically buy it. And if you want to talk about a mental disease, we're told he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And then the question is, did he understand the nature of what he was doing?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Not guilty by reason of insanity. Hold on, not so fast. I don't know who the dude is on TMZ or what his qualifications are, but I'm not sure they're in law. Maybe they are. There is a possibility that Nick may try to plead diminished responsibility, and perhaps he will end up serving time in a mental health facility. Why? Because his mental health committed the crime, not him. Because his mental health didn't want to be caught, not him. Because his mental health didn't want to go to rehab, not him. And so can you see, as soon as you make this whole thing about mental health, then you suddenly give him a complete pass. And so this person that's there suddenly fades away and it all becomes about mental health. Like mental health is some kind of alien entity that completely takes over. And I don't think that's the right legal outcome, because one of the tests is whether the perpetrator had guilty knowledge of his actions. If Nick committed the crime and he ended up mumbling incoherently on a street corner or still in the guest house, then maybe. But what do we see? Well, we see him acting sensibly afterwards. We see him able to flee his home and the crime scene, to book himself into a hotel room after the fact with his credit card, to take a shower. He's able to dress himself, transport himself to a convenience store, buy himself sustenance. It's also interesting that the night after the murders, Sunday night, Nick still hadn't returned home. Why not? Well, wasn't it because of guilty knowledge? And here it is, you cannot successfully plead not guilty by reason of insanity if you possess guilty knowledge, meaning if you are capable of understanding the nature of your actions and of distinguishing right from wrong at the time the crime was committed, well, then you can't say you weren't aware of what you were doing. In order to use this insanity defense, it requires a defendant to demonstrate they lack this capacity due to a severe mental disease or defect. Something else that I think will weigh heavily on Nick is the moment of his apprehension and arrest. He very quickly put his hands up and lay on the ground, indicating he seemed to understand what was going on and why he was being arrested. It remains to be seen from body cam and testimonies from the arresting officers, but I doubt that Nick said to the cops, "Why are you doing this to me?" I suspect he was silent. Why? Well, wasn't it because he knew? When the cops arrested him, did he have guilty knowledge then? What do you think? Now, when guilty knowledge is present, there is understanding the act. If you knew the physical nature and quality of your actions, you know, what was going to lead to that, you know, picking up a knife, going into the bedroom, killing one person, that person dying, then killing the other person. Did he understand what he was doing? Also, knowing the act was wrong. If you are capable of appreciating that your actions were legally or morally wrong, even if you committed them due to an irresistible impulse, then there's also concealment of the crime. Actions taken after the crime, such as concealing evidence, bolting the door, or attempting to abscond, are any of these present here with Nick Reiner. These can be used as evidence that the defendant was conscious of their guilt and therefore had the requisite guilty knowledge at the time of the offense. So the mere fact that Nick sleep somewhere else that night? When last did he sleep somewhere else? Why on that night of all nights did he sleep somewhere else? What does that tell you? Then there are other circumstances limiting the plea, such as voluntary intoxication. Generally, if a mental state is the result of voluntary intoxication, drugs or alcohol, that's not a valid basis for an insanity defense, certainly not with adults. Then there's also temporary mental abnormality. The condition must stem from a recognized mental disease or defect, not a temporary clouding of faculties due to external stimuli. And so if he has been recently diagnosed with schizophrenia, perhaps there is some room to move in this particular area. I also think the use of a knife to commit the crime, and it's 2 murders here, not 1, is an aggravating factor. I don't think you can claim even that this is a heat of passion crime, because the nature of the injuries weren't random, and his parents were clearly not attacking him from their bed in their own bedroom. This appears to be a premeditated murder. Then there's also guilty but mentally ill jurisdictions. Some states have an alternative verdict of guilty but mentally ill, which means you are found criminally liable but receive treatment before or during your prison sentence. In these states, the traditional not guilty by reason of insanity plea may be more restricted. I'm not that familiar with California law to know to what extent that is applicable here. In any event, in this analysis, I want to make sure we aren't looking at this case from a schizophrenic perspective either, where we suddenly say, this guy's got schizophrenia and so he's going to be innocent. He's off the hook. And so I want to make my case almost as a prosecutor would for Nick's mental health as opposed to mental illness. And we're going to do that using information we know about Nick, things that have been said on the record. Then I also want to encourage you to stay tuned or watch this space. I'm going to be doing another video, basically a part 2 to this one, dealing with something that is really interesting. It's really Rob Reiner's difficulty in getting out from his father's shadow. And I basically want to do a personal take on how one can do that and why Nick perhaps failed to do that. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button. A big welcome to the many of you who have subscribed, and let's get started. As recently as September this year, that's like 3 months ago, Rob Reiner, attending a premiere with his family, said that he believed Nick was finally in a good place. And I think Nick was right there with him. Oh, so didn't he have schizophrenia then? But now that he's committed a crime, double murder allegedly, now he's mentally ill. Wasn't he too mentally ill to attend this premiere? You know, if he was mentally ill all along, why hasn't he been in an institution all along? Why was he staying in the family guest house? And why is he attending premieres and parties if he's so sick? In September this year, Rob Reiner said that Nick was great and claimed he was clean. He said, he's been great, hasn't been doing drugs for over 6 years. He's in a really good place. So he didn't have schizophrenia or mental health problems 3 months ago, but now he does, and he's had them his whole life. Oh, and not doing drugs for 6 years, that takes us back to 2019. We know it was 2017 when he trashed the guest house, so that actually does sound right, that does sound accurate. According to Fox News, Nick connected his substance abuse to the pressures of living up to his famous family, Rob and then his grandfather, so his father Rob and his grandfather Carl Reiner. If you think about that, what does that have to do with mental illness or schizophrenia? You know, living up to the pressures of his famous family. What does that have to do with mental illness?
What does that got to do with anything?
Everything.
Actually, no. I think Nick's response to his father's fame was a real, legit, and sane response. I think a lot of people may feel that way in their own situations. So how can he be operating under these clean and clear psychological tensions if he had schizophrenia? It's also not that he was so caught up in mental illness that he couldn't account for his actions or his psychological malaise. I'm talking about at the time. He was self-aware enough to be able to explicate his feelings, his motives, in this case, to make a cathartic movie with his father. Again, that is a sign of mental clarity and mental health, not mental illness. Back to the article from Fox News, he said, I had no identity and I had no passions. That's his own admission. Not just that he had no identity, but no passions. Probably his only passion was taking drugs. He said that on a podcast in 2016. And he said, I think the reason I had no identity was because I have a famous dad and a famous grandpa, and that fame sort of informs who you are. So I wanted to edge out my own identity with a more rebellious, angry, drug-addicted sort of persona. I must say, I don't find that particularly inspiring or clever or particularly well conceived or even creative. But I think it's very interesting that he admits that he had no passions. And if we edit out a portion of that statement, and this is important because it's a self-identifying statement, what does he say? He says, so I wanted to edge out my own identity with a drug-addicted sort of persona. And if we edit it even further, I wanted a drug-addicted sort of persona. And that's what he got. That's what he has been for most of his life. And look at those words, if we edit it even further, I wanted a drug. And that's what he got. That's what he was doing. That was his passion. That little video he made seems to confirm this as well. He seems to think taking drugs and being addicted is cool. It's a choice made from a position of intelligence and clear thinking, not insanity or mental illness. He thinks it's also, seems to be this idea that the rich can afford to live like this. And so from that choice onwards, everything that happens, whether he likes it or not, is his responsibility, including not taking responsibility for his life or his attempt to not take responsibility for other people's lives. He's still responsible. He's also responsible for refusing to go to rehab and apparently resisting rehab when he did go. According to people, when Rob learned that his son Nick started using drugs when he was 14, Rob said that he overreacted by immediately sending Nick to a treatment center. The Reiners came to regret forcing Nick, who admitted he grew angry at his parents, into programs, they said. And so one wonders whether this is what happened on the night of the murders. It was that whole thing all over again. You're going to go to a treatment center, and what happens? Nick grew angry. It does seem like the kind of crime we're talking about with a knife and the type of injuries is someone who was angry at his parents. And hadn't he been angry at his parents in a sense his whole life? I also think this statement, when he was sober and when he was functional, speaks volumes and speaks to this thing that I've just mentioned, this anger, this animus. This is also from Fox News. Time and candid conversation seem to have healed the rift at the time that Rob made Being Charlie. I used to harbor a lot of ill will toward them, Nick told People in 2016, but it's diminished to almost zero. Well, clearly not if he murdered both parents 9 years later. And notice even in 2016, he doesn't say he harbored some ill will to his father. He says he harbored a lot of ill will toward them, to both his parents. And remember, not just one parent was murdered here, both were murdered. If his so-called ill will, I call it animus, if his animus diminished, it didn't diminish to zero, and clearly at some point that animus, that ill will, began to increase again. Was that due to schizophrenia? Was that due to, I want to take drugs and you not letting me? And Rob was aware of this, which is why in some of his last comments before his death, he said he was scared of Nick. Well, that fear didn't just happen on December 13th going into 14th. It didn't come about in a vacuum. That was going on in the lead up as well, wasn't it? So I think schizophrenia here is a process, but it wasn't there all along, and it didn't suddenly materialize on the night of the murders. It evolved, and it evolved in lockstep with choices to use certain substances, actions, taking these substances which he knew the patterns of, knew what they did to him, knew what harm they caused, and he used them anyway. And so I think ultimately the real test will be what he was on at the time, also what medications he was on and how these were perhaps altered, and what blood tests reveal in that respect. Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. I hope you're going to have a wonderful Christmas weekend, this weekend, and then leading up to Christmas itself. That is, obviously, if you celebrate Christmas. Also, remember to look out for part 2 in this little mini-series where we'll look at how Rob got out from under the shadow of his father and how Nick perhaps failed to learn those lessons, and also the lessons we can learn from those failures and what is the right way to do that. So look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.